Thank you, Cameron, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with all of you here in Brazil this week. My first trip to this country, and it has been a great experience. I wish I would have the opportunity to stay for another 3 days here as opposed to getting on a flight at midnight tonight to go to our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. As Cameron had introduced me, just a quick perspective about the U.S. beef industry. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is when we think about this word sustainability, I'd like to address probably the three most critical questions in the back of your mind right now relative to this topic is about why and what and how. And then I'll leave you with a few next steps. So when we think about this question, why, I think it's important to understand what are the dynamics and what's happening within the U.S. beef industry. We are a country that is very proud to produce 26 billion plus pounds of beef every year. And today we're operating that with about 30 million beef cows and about 9.5 million dairy cows. So when you look at the efficiencies within our systems, it's something that the U.S. beef industry is very proud of, but at the same time, we have this analogy that I'd like to begin to put in your mind. So think of a picture of a pin cushion. And when you think about all the pins that are sticking into this little red pin cushion, that's what it feels like to be involved with the U.S. beef community and start to talk about this word called sustainability. That is certainly what it's been like for me and our colleagues over the past 5 years when we start to engage with consumers and stakeholders all across not just what we refer to as the beef supply chain, but what we commonly refer to as the beef community. So why is that analogy of a pin cushion relevant to this discussion? The reason starts with when you think about demand. Well, let's first understand that in the U.S., we have 330 million people. But when we look at the total amount of beef that is produced, we consume about 85% of that, and we export about 15% of it in terms of round numbers. So our U.S. consumer and their influencers are very, very critical to any discussion about this word sustainability. But equally as important, though, we know that 96% of the world's population lives outside of the United States and our borders, so it's very important that we understand how all of this fits together at the global level. That, in a nutshell, is why we are here. And to further illustrate why we're here, we have to understand what is it that is driving demand for beef. As we started talking yesterday, there were a couple of questions that started to ask, well, what about the consumer in this discussion? As opposed to any of our views, we have to back up and understand what is it that is driving or limiting their preference for beef, not only in the USA, but around the world. For us in the United States, it starts with number one, price. Number two, safety. Number three, human nutrition. And number four is where this word sustainability starts to come in, but it's in an area of a demand driver that we refer to as image. So in other words, how that beef eating experience is produced is what leads us to this word and then gives us another picture I'd like to put in the back of your mind. Picture yourself out in, whether it's in your home country or my home state of Texas within the United States or even out in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, and you're at a crossroads. Folks, I would suggest to you that not just the U.S. beef community, but the global beef community is at a crossroads, and that is at the epicenter of why I think all of us are here. The pressures that we are feeling in this pincushion analogy and linked further to this crossroads analogy start with what? Start with the pressures coming from the use of technologies. The use of productivity technologies that make us efficient and effective as a global beef community. And I can surely attest that's true in the U.S. Number two is the agendas. Agendas by activists that certainly do not like the producers that I represent every day, the fact that they're even in business, let alone how they want to progress, not only to feed their families, families around the world. Third is that of government policy. And I'll just leave that one right at the door, because we could spend all afternoon talking about the pressures that come from policy made by our government officials that do more to inhibit a producer's ability to have that freedom to operate responsibly than enhance it. But the fourth area, when we think about this crossroads of what's facing us, and maybe what is that pressure point in this pincushion analogy, is changing consumer preference. When we look at changing consumer preference in the U.S., I think that is the epicenter of why I would say we need to start with why. Starting with why allows us to back up and understand what are our motives, our convictions, and more importantly, as each of these roundtables are trying to begin their journey, whether they're 1 month into it or 10 years into it, they had to start with the answer of this question of why. We think the answer starts at the center of enhancing consumer trust in today's beef community. How we demonstrate this fourth driver of demand in terms of image about how the beef eating experience was produced, and that it truly was produced consistent with the values not only of the producers and the beef community, but also consistent with the value of consumers all around the world, especially those in the millennial generation, is something that's at the core of why we think we can start to look at this picture and this image and come back to home base with, okay, if that's why, then what is it that we want to accomplish in the area of beef sustainability, and then how do we best go about it? So with that why in mind, let's start to talk a little bit about what we are trying to accomplish in the U.S. and how collectively it's all about collaboration, coordination, and communication. When you look at the dialogue that Kim Essex presented in her breakout presentation yesterday about all the research that we've looked at, looking at consumer behavior, a lot of times we try to do what? Push our story at them rather than tell them we need to start listening first and engaging in a dialogue and understanding what's important to them, especially when they start to understand the word sustainability and we start to balance that. What I'm trying to suggest that in the very first steps of everything we're doing is creating some level of balance. Because I can assure you, 5 years ago, I had producers that would have responded to me with a red face and an angry voice of saying, we're going to do what? And we said, yes, this is the first place that we need to start. You heard Dr. Frank Mitloehner speak to it today, that if you're going to have any sense of credibility to be able to manage the emotion that sometimes centers around a consumer's perspective of how a beef eating experience might have been produced, you better have your science and your facts in order. Otherwise, you have no credible way to engage in the conversation. So 4 years ago, we made a decision that we were going to work from producers collaborating across the supply chain to be able to invest over 3 years and over $3 million to do a one-of-its-kind, first-of-its-kind beef life cycle assessment to really truly set a benchmark for what is our footprint, and looking at it not only from an environmental perspective, but also from a social perspective, and again, the third pillar of the economic perspective. This infographic is what we want people to start to focus on, as opposed to the previous infographic that I shared with you that starts to puzzle more questions than it does answers. This starts to tell the story in a way that engages with consumers in a very effective way. We're very proud of what has happened, and as you can see on this infographic, it starts to give you 3 years worth of work and over $3 million of investment. In one slide, the outcomes that our life cycle assessment has told us. It's answered the questions as a means of starting the discussion with a scientific foundation and data that allows us to say, where do we go from here? What is it that we need to continually improve on? And then how are we going to go about doing that and engaging the entire beef community? When we start to look at the discussion among producers, I want to back up to that, because that, as we've had discussions between Cameron and several of our staff and state partners that are here with us, as well as other stakeholders in the beef community, producers did not understand this word. It meant so many different things to them, and most of the time, quite frankly, it was a negative term to them. So we had to back up and understand, okay, what is it as our statement of belief? How do we begin to define this in a means of giving them ownership of that definition, again, that links all the way back to the 3 pillars, as well as the notion of what continuous improvement is all about, and then start to define some principles. So when you start to look at having information that you can use from research to begin the education process, the biggest step for us has been how we engage up and down what most people refer to again as the beef supply chain that we're trying to look at is through the lens of the beef community. The beef community from producers to packer processor, retail, food service, NGO, university, and other stakeholders in the allied agribusiness space. Every single member of the beef community has a voice at this table and in this discussions. So as we started this engagement, here's what we learned. We partnered with the World Wildlife Fund, and some of our producers said, "You are going to partner with who?" They didn't understand the true motives behind what that collaboration and our relationship with an NGO was really about. So we were able to bring influencers, key influencers of the beef community together with other stakeholders and looked at a way that we can start the conversation throughout the value chain by connecting all of these different stakeholders. And through these workshops, here's what we learned. We were able to move the needle in terms of consumer influencer perceptions as they came into the workshop and seeing how beef is produced real-time, hands-on. And when they came out of that workshop, we were able to move, again, as you can see with this first slide, 18 to 25% of the positives in terms of their perceptions about beef outweighed the negatives. When we start to look at their overall perception about whether beef is sustainably produced, we move the needle from about 88 to about 93%. So when you start to say, okay, how are you proceeding from here? How are you moving forward? What I'm trying to suggest is that as you look at the different roundtable discussions that are here today, what we've tried to do is begin this journey with a very strong foundation of data and information, not as science to trump emotion, but as information that allows us to have knowledge to engage in a more meaningful conversation about not only what we should be continually improving, but how we best go about that. We pulled together the group of stakeholders that have been coalescing for about a year and a half to understand how does this effort look. That was just here about 6 weeks ago at our office in Denver, Colorado. We aligned to what would be some of our common goals, objectives, and more critically, how that links back to this effort at GRSB. We were able to focus again on the 3 C's of collaboration, coordination, and communication, and ultimately the outcome out of that workshop was that we would move forward with the working group representing every constituent. We would come back together with a plan of action between now and the end of the year, and in January we would regroup and align. From that point, we would move forward with implementing that plan of action with whatever this U.S. Roundtable is going to be called, and that you will see take a lot of momentum at a very rapid pace and in a very integrated way as we head into the first quarter of 2015. So here's a few things that I'd like to just leave you with as we think about what this effort is and what this effort is not. This effort is not about mandates and standards in the U.S. It is not about dictating production practices. What it is about linking these demand drivers, especially this fourth one around image. It's about looking at all 3 of the pillars. It's about defining this as continuous improvement over time of what we're measuring. As you have all heard multiple times here this week, it's not a destination, but it is more of a journey that we are focused on. And today in the United States, we feel very strongly that we do have a sustainable product, and we're trying to look at these mechanisms and this engagement and this collaboration as a means of having a more sustainable product for tomorrow. So the last thing I'll leave you with is, as you think about this slide, there's probably a couple of questions. And I hope the first question about what this is versus what this is not about is very clear in your mind. But the question that I think all of us need to ask is, what is our leadership role as we move forward out of this conference? Leadership is a big word. Leadership in a nutshell, I believe, can be defined as influence. And if you do not have integrity, if you do not have a set of ethical, moral, foundational principles, and the ability ultimately to build trust, you will never be able to influence, let alone the consumer, our constituents. So with that, I hope that's provided you with a little bit of a snapshot of our journey, and look forward to the questions here in a few minutes.